Ladies and gentlemen, there are moments in life when the very ground beneath you shifts, not because of an earthquake, not because of some cosmic event, but because someone close to you decides to ask a question you never thought needed asking. And sometimes that question pierces deeper than you're prepared for. Sometimes it forces you to confront truths you didn't know you were avoiding. And sometimes it comes from someone who loves you enough to risk your anger, your confusion, even your disappointment, just to make sure you're stepping into your future with open eyes. For me, that moment began with a single sentence from my dad, a man who has spent his entire life dissecting human behavior, motivations, and contradictions with the precision of a machine and the tenderness of someone who's seen too much of the world to take anything at face value. He said very calmly, "I looked into her life." At first, his words didn't even register emotionally. It felt clinical, like he was reporting the results of a lab experiment. No judgment, no suspicion, no tone that suggested he wanted to influence my decision. It was simply data. And yet, behind that data was the realization that he had taken a step I had not asked him to take, dipped into the life of someone I cared about, and held it up under a microscope. I remember standing there, not angry, not yet, just confused. In relationships, we often believe discovery should unfold naturally, like a story written moment by moment. We think love should be an exploration, not an audit. And here he was turning what felt like an emotional process into an investigative one. But he didn't apologize. He didn't back away. He simply said, "You need to hear this." And what came next changed everything, but not in the way I expected. Before I tell you what he found, there's something important to understand. Human nature is deeply shaped by uncertainty, and uncertainty makes the brain do strange things. Neuroscience shows us that when we care about someone deeply, the emotional circuits of trust and fear become highly active. The amygdala, the part of the brain that processes emotional threats, starts to scan not just the world but the future. It becomes hypersensitive. It fills in gaps with imagined outcomes. And love, ironically, can make us blind in some areas and hypervigilant in others. My father understood that. He always has. He has this way of seeing around emotional corners that most of us don't even realize exist. He said, "I didn't look into her life to judge her. I looked because I needed to understand the parts of her story she may not be ready to tell you. Everyone has them. Even you." That made me pause, because he was right. And we all know this. Every human being carries unspoken chapters, memories we bury, mistakes we rewrite, fears we camouflage because they don't fit the version of ourselves we hope others will see. Especially when we're in love. I sat down. Not because he asked me to, but because something in my chest tightened, that subtle psychological signal that tells you, pay attention. This moment matters. He took a breath, and then he began to share, not rumors, not gossip, not the kind of digital breadcrumbs people obsessively collect on social media. What he found were human truths. He found the story of someone who had been hurt before, deeply. Someone who had loved intensely and lost painfully. Someone who had made mistakes at 16, that she still blamed herself for at 28. Someone who had grown up in a family where emotional expression was often misinterpreted as weakness, which meant she had learned to hold everything inside until the pressure became unbearable. He found a woman who was trying, truly trying, to become someone better than her past, even if parts of that past still clung to her like shadows. And then he said something that struck me so hard I felt my entire worldview tilt. She has spent so long expecting people to leave that she doesn't know what to do when someone wants to stay. I leaned back, absorbing that, because suddenly everything made sense. The hesitation in her voice when she shared something vulnerable, the instinctive apologies for things that didn't need apologies, the way she seemed almost surprised when I showed her patience or warmth. Neuroscience calls this anticipatory loss behavior, the brain preparing itself for abandonment before it even happens, because it believes hurt is inevitable. People who've lived through emotional instability often develop this pattern without even realizing it. But to me, hearing this wasn't discouraging. It was humanizing. It made her real in a way I had never seen before. It made her more than a person I admired. It made her someone who had fought to stand where she stood. My father didn't stop there. He continued carefully, as if choosing each word with precision. He told me she had been working 2 jobs at one point, not out of ambition, but because she was supporting someone in her family quietly, without asking for recognition. He told me she had volunteered anonymously at a community shelter every winter for 5 years, never taking a picture, never posting about it, never mentioning it because, as she once wrote in an email I never would have seen, doing good loses its meaning when it becomes a performance. You know, in a world where almost everything is curated, filtered, or broadcast, the idea of someone choosing anonymity in their kindness is incredibly rare. It requires integrity when no one is watching. And that, in many ways, reveals the truest form of character. But there was something more, something that surprised even him. He said, "She worries she's not good enough for the life you're building." That sentence hit with the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears, hers, and maybe even mine. Because I realized, in that moment, that love is not just about admiration. It's not about compatibility algorithms or shared interests, or the clean lines of a perfectly structured future. It's about understanding the silent wounds another person carries. It's about choosing to stay when their vulnerabilities surface. It's about believing in their healing even when they doubt it themselves. And then my father did something I did not expect. He sat down, looked at me with a softness I had rarely seen in him, and said, "She's been tested by life, and she passed. Not because she never fell, but because she kept standing. I wanted you to know what you're stepping into, not to scare you, but to show you the truth. And if you truly love her, this truth shouldn't shake you. It should anchor you." I remember sitting with those words for a long time, because he wasn't giving me a warning. He was giving me clarity. And clarity, especially in relationships, is often the difference between short-lived affection and a bond that endures. What he found wasn't danger. It wasn't red flags. It wasn't hidden motives. What he found was a human being, a complex, imperfect, resilient human being who had survived storms she never talked about. And I realized something profound, something supported by psychology, neuroscience, and every meaningful connection I've ever witnessed. People do not need perfection to build a life with someone. They need truth. They need transparency. They need the courage to show the parts of themselves they fear will drive others away. And they need someone who will respond not with judgment, but with understanding. That night, I didn't feel betrayed that my father looked into her life. I felt grateful that someone cared enough to uncover the full picture, not to interfere, but to help me see the depth of the journey ahead. And when I saw her next, when I looked into her eyes, I saw not just the woman I admired, but the battles she had survived, the strength she didn't talk about, and the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would choose her not despite her past, but with full awareness of it. That kind of love, that kind of partnership, is built intentionally. It's built with empathy. It's built with honesty. And it's built with the understanding that every human being is a story, one that deserves to be read fully, not skimmed. And as I stood there looking at her, understanding her in a way I hadn't before, something remarkable happened. The mind has these subtle shifts, almost imperceptible, where a feeling reorganizes itself, where perception updates in real time. It's the same kind of neural recalibration that happens when new information doesn't just add to your worldview, but reshapes it. That evening, my mind made that shift. Not because I suddenly knew everything about her, but because I finally saw the architecture beneath her actions, the quiet circuitry of her fears, her hopes, her defenses, her resilience. I realized then how easy it is to misinterpret someone when we only see the surface. We live in a world where people present the polished version of their identity like a product, a world where we judge others based on fragments, snapshots, or curated impressions. But the human psyche, it's not a profile picture. It's not a highlight reel. It's an evolving ecosystem of memories, neural pathways, emotional residues, and survival strategies. When you understand this, truly understand it, you stop asking, "Why is she like this?" and start asking, "What happened that shaped her this way?" That simple shift is where compassion lives. A neuroscientist once told me that every person carries two versions of themselves, the one they consciously express, and the one encoded unconsciously through years of lived experience. And when you love someone, you are essentially choosing both versions, the parts they reveal, and the parts they don't know how to explain. My father's investigation, which initially felt like an intrusion, ended up illuminating the unspoken version of her, the version shaped by early losses, by difficult relationships, by long nights spent trying to be enough for people who never saw her fully. And suddenly, instead of wondering whether I had chosen the right person, my mind shifted to a deeper question. Am I prepared to be the person she deserves? That's not a question driven by insecurity. It's driven by responsibility. Because love, real love, is not merely receiving someone's best moments, it is holding space for their most fragile ones. Over the next few days, I kept replaying what he told me. Not obsessively, not fearfully, but thoughtfully. You see, the brain has a remarkable ability called reconsolidation. It updates memories when new emotional information is introduced. And everything I thought I understood about her was being rewritten with more depth. I realized her quietness in some conversations wasn't distance, it was caution. Her hesitation before telling me something personal wasn't secrecy, it was a lifetime of being unheard. Her tendency to take the blame, even when she wasn't at fault, wasn't weakness, it was conditioning. And I remember thinking, how many times do we judge people for behaviors that are simply old survival strategies? When you see someone through the lens of understanding, everything changes. Even the things that once frustrated you start to make sense. Their patterns, their fears, the ways they protect themselves, it all becomes a map. And that map guides you, not away from them but toward them, because you finally see the landscape clearly. But then something unexpected happened, something my father didn't anticipate either. A few days later, he sat with me again, and this time he looked almost unsettled. There was a weight in his posture, not heavy but thoughtful. He said, "There's something I didn't tell you." Now, normally, that sentence is the precursor to bad news, some revelation meant to shake your confidence. But when he continued, his voice softened. He said, "I wasn't evaluating her, I was evaluating you." That stopped me cold. He leaned forward, hands clasped, and continued, "I wanted to see how you would respond to her past, not because I doubted her, but because I wanted to know if you were ready for the kind of commitment you say you want. I wanted to see if you have the emotional bandwidth to hold someone who doesn't come wrapped in perfection." Suddenly everything clicked. He wasn't judging her. He was testing the depth of my character. It was a moment I'll never forget, because it reminded me that relationships aren't about finding someone who fits a checklist. They're about becoming someone who can love another human being in their full complexity. My father wasn't looking for flaws in her. He was looking for maturity in me. And maybe that's what every meaningful partnership requires. Not just the courage to choose someone, but the courage to grow into the version of yourself that can sustain that choice. That night, when I spoke to her, I felt myself listening differently. Not just hearing words, but hearing the emotions beneath them. I was paying attention in a way I hadn't before, tracking the subtle changes in her tone, the small pauses that signaled hesitation, the micro expressions that revealed more than her sentences ever could. It was like discovering a language I thought I spoke, but was only now learning to understand fluently. She told me things she had never said out loud, not because she was ready before, but because she sensed intuitively that something in me had shifted. Humans are incredibly perceptive. We underestimate how much we communicate without words. When you truly see someone, they feel it, and when they feel seen, they open. As she spoke, I realized something profound. The greatest gift you can give someone is not fixing their past or rescuing them from their fears. It is offering them a safe place to exist without performing. She didn't need someone to investigate her life. She needed someone who understood it. And in that moment, I knew I wanted to be that person. But the story doesn't end there. In fact, the most surprising part came later, when my father called me again. This time he wasn't analytical. He wasn't cautious, he sounded hopeful. He said, "There's something else you should know." He paused as if choosing his words with care. "She reminds me of your mother, not in personality, not in background, but in the way she loves, quietly, deeply, without needing attention. And I thought maybe that's the kind of foundation you need." I didn't expect that. Not from him. Not after a lifetime of watching him navigate emotions with the precision of a surgeon and the detachment of a scientist. But something in her had touched something in him, something he didn't talk about often, something from his own past. He said, "If you choose her fully. She's the kind of woman whose love strengthens you, but only if you meet her with the same depth." Those words stayed with me for days. They still do. Because they weren't instructions, they were wisdom. The kind you only hear from someone who has lived long enough to know the cost of half-hearted love. And as I stand here speaking with you today, sharing this story, I realize that what my father gave me was more than information. He gave me perspective. He helped me understand that love is never just about chemical attraction or emotional comfort. It is a psychological partnership, a merging of histories, a shared journey into futures neither person can fully predict. You don't choose a partner's past. You choose the role you're willing to play in their future. And the truth he uncovered, the truth I watched unfold before me, wasn't a warning. It was an invitation to grow, to understand, to love more intelligently, to love more humanly, to love not the fantasy of who someone could be, but the truth of who they are. And that, more than anything else, reshaped the path I was walking. And over time, something remarkable began to happen, something I didn't anticipate when this entire journey began. The more I understood her story, the more I understood myself. It's strange how relationships do that. You think you're learning about another person, but in the process, you uncover hidden corridors within your own psyche. The parts you avoid, the parts you protect, the parts you pretend don't matter until someone holds up a mirror, gently but unmistakably. One evening, while reflecting on everything my father had revealed and everything she had shared, I caught myself asking a question that seemed so simple yet carried enormous weight. Why was I so afraid of discovering the truth? Not because I expected something terrible, but because in some quiet place inside me, I feared that knowing her fully meant she would see me fully in return. That's the paradox of love. The deeper it becomes, the more it threatens your internal safeguards. It invites vulnerability. It invites truth. It invites exposure. And for many of us, that exposure feels like standing beneath a spotlight with every flaw illuminated. Neuroscience tells us that vulnerability triggers the same neural pathways as physical danger. The brain doesn't distinguish between emotional risk and physical risk. To the amygdala, it's all the same. Which means when someone gets close, deeply close, the instinctive reaction isn't always warmth. Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's pulling back. Sometimes it's self-protection disguised as indifference. But when I looked at her, really looked at her, I realized that the only thing I was risking was the comfort of staying unchanged. Growth always requires surrendering some part of your old identity. And loving someone deeply requires surrendering the illusion that you can control the outcome. That's when everything my father had done, the investigation, the conversations, the uncomfortable truths, finally made sense. He wasn't trying to protect me from her. He was trying to prepare me for the version of myself I needed to become in order to love her well. There is a kind of maturity that only comes from understanding the weight of another person's story. It's not the romanticized version of love, it's the disciplined version, the kind that demands emotional intelligence, patience, responsibility, and presence. And as I grew into that realization, I found myself shifting from simply admiring her to truly honoring her. I remember the exact moment when the shift became permanent. We were sitting together, quietly, on a night when neither of us felt the need to fill the silence. She rested her head on my shoulder, with a kind of gentle trust that I hadn't seen in her before. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't theatrical. It was subtle, but it was the kind of gesture that only comes from someone who finally feels safe. And I realize that safety is the foundation of love, not passion, not chemistry, not excitement, safety. The psychological kind, the kind that tells your nervous system, you can exhale here. In that moment, I felt myself exhale too, because I finally understood why my father had intervened the way he did. He wasn't trying to control my choices. He was trying to ensure I was choosing from a place of clarity, not fantasy, not projection, not blind optimism. He knew that love, like any complex system, requires awareness of every component, not just the appealing ones. And now that I understood her fully, now that I saw her for who she truly was, strength, scars, hope, contradictions, and all, I wasn't intimidated by her complexity. I was inspired by it. And here's the part I didn't expect. The more I embraced her truth, the more she stepped into her own strength. That's how relationships work at their best. When you create emotional space for someone, their nervous system responds. The brain rewires. Old fears begin to dissolve. New patterns emerge. Where there was once hesitation, there is now openness. Where there was once self-protection, there is trust. She began to tell me stories from her childhood she had never shared. She laughed more. She apologized less. She looked at me without the flicker of doubt that once lived behind her eyes. And every time I saw that transformation, I was reminded of something fundamental. People bloom in environments where they feel safe. The truth my father uncovered did not fracture us, it deepened us. It made me realize that love is not the destination. It's the project, the ongoing construction of two parallel histories merging into one shared future. And like any meaningful construction, it requires knowledge of every structural vulnerability. The unexpected gift of this entire ordeal was that it taught me how to love not with instinct alone, but with intention. And as the months unfolded, my relationship with her evolved from a promise into a partnership, not the kind defined by grand gestures, but the kind defined by the small moments only two people who truly understand each other can appreciate. The way she reaches for my hand when she's uncertain. The way she looks at me when she's proud of something she finally allowed herself to attempt. The way she breathes a little deeper when she feels supported. One night, I found myself telling my father something I had never said before. I said, "You were right." He looked at me not with pride, but with a quiet recognition. He said, "I wasn't right about her. I was right about you. You were ready, you just didn't know it yet." And that was the moment I understood the full arc of this story. This was never about her past. This was never about the investigation. This wasn't even about whether she was the right person for me. This journey was about becoming the person capable of meeting her where she is, not where I imagined she'd be. It was about maturity. It was about clarity. It was about empathy. It was about stepping into a deeper version of love, one that sees beyond appearances, beyond assumptions, beyond a surface level certainty. And if there is one message I want to leave you with today, it is this. The strength of a relationship is not determined by how perfectly two people fit together, but by how courageously they choose to understand each other. Love doesn't thrive in the absence of challenge. It thrives in the presence of truth. And sometimes it takes someone who knows you better than you know yourself to help you see that truth. So to my father, though he will never hear these words on a stage like this, thank you. Not for protecting me, not for investigating her, but for reminding me that love is not something you fall into. It is something you build, deliberately, consciously, day by day, choice by choice. And to the woman I am building a future with, you were never defined by your past. You were refined by it. And standing beside you, I am refined too. Ladies and gentlemen, may you all find a love that is courageous enough to know the truth, gentle enough to embrace it, and strong enough to grow because of it. Thank you.